Ever thought you knew someone, only to learn their darkest secrets were hidden behind a smile? Tonight, we explore stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people in your life. Get ready for the most shocking revelations. Story 1. The Dark Secret of a Friend. It was a typical Thursday evening, and the usual group of friends had gathered at our regular spot, a cozy living room filled with laughter and the occasional clink of ice cubes in a drink. As we sat around, the topic inevitably turned to our weekly Dungeons & Dragons game. The group had been meeting for months and we had gotten close over time. We had shared countless stories, inside jokes, and for some of us even personal secrets. But that evening there was something different in the air. Something unsettling. It started with a conversation I had with one of the group members. Let's call him G. I had always considered G to be an easygoing guy, someone you could rely on for a laugh or a distraction. We'd spent hours together on the campaign, navigating our imaginary worlds with camaraderie and good-natured teasing. But recently his behavior had begun to shift. He seemed to linger around longer than necessary, his conversations more erratic. At first I thought I was just overthinking things, but as time went on, his unsettling presence began to become harder to ignore. One evening G pulled me aside after the game, his voice low, almost shaky. "I need to tell you something. Something important," he said, his eyes darting around nervously. I was used to his odd moments of seriousness, but this felt different. He seemed almost panicked. I nodded, curious but cautious. G, in his usual self-deprecating way, had always had a dark sense of humor, but this felt far too real. "I've been seeing someone," he started, but before he could continue I felt my stomach drop. "It's not what you think," he added quickly as though trying to put me at ease. But nothing could prepare me for the words that followed. What he told me that night was something I could hardly wrap my mind around. G revealed that he had been involved in deeply troubling behavior, things that were beyond any joke or playful banter. His voice trembled as he confessed to dark urges and actions that made my blood run cold. I tried to process his words, but they seemed to blur together as my heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to act, but what could I do? I was in shock, unable to fully comprehend what he was saying. Still, one thing was clear: I could no longer keep playing pretend. G's actions were serious, and I felt the weight of responsibility press on me. He wasn't just a friend, he was someone who had been allowed into my life, into my home. The thought of what he might be capable of left me feeling uneasy, even fearful. For a while, I didn't know how to handle it. Should I tell the others? Should I go to the authorities? I decided to speak to a few trusted people in the group, carefully weighing my options. After long discussions and deliberation, we made the decision to ask G to leave the group. We assured him that we wouldn't reveal the details of his confession to the others. Keeping it private seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But honestly, I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing. Would I be protecting him or protecting everyone else? After G agreed to leave, I tried to put the whole thing behind me, but the unease never fully left. Weeks went by and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere in the periphery of my life. He had been to my house. He knew where I lived. That thought gnawed at me. The fact that G had a young child only added to my sense of dread. I hoped that the authorities were handling the situation and that the necessary steps were being taken to address his visitation rights, but deep down, I knew the truth. The thought of someone like G having access to children made me sick to my stomach. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind, but the fear remained. The group drifted apart, our D&D sessions fading into the background as life moved on. But still, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice in not telling everyone else what had happened. Should I have warned them? Should I have gone public with what I knew? I eventually moved away from the house, but the memory of G and the chilling conversation we had lingered like a shadow. I tried to avoid thinking about it, but the feelings of unease crept back in when I least expected it. The truth of what someone could hide, even under the guise of friendship, still haunted me. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that conversation and wonder if I did enough. Was it right to keep his secret, to protect him at the cost of my own peace of mind? I'll never truly know. But I've learned one thing for certain. People aren't always what they seem, and even the closest friendships can harbor the darkest secrets. Story 2. The Saint with a Dark Past. Imagine a man whose generosity knew no bounds, someone revered by his community for his selfless acts, a saint in the eyes of those who sought his help. That man was Ivan, a Croatian immigrant who settled in Canada after World War II. In our small town, he was a legend, known for his endless charity, his willingness to help anyone in need, and the quiet dignity he carried despite the wealth he had amassed over the years. But behind that saintly exterior, a hidden past haunted him. A past that, if it had come to light, would have shattered the image everyone had of him. My grandmother was one of those who had always admired Ivan. She spoke of him often, praising his kindness, his willingness to help newcomers adjust to life in Canada. As a young immigrant herself, my grandmother had seen firsthand how Ivan went out of his way to assist families in finding work, teaching them English and even offering them a place to stay. He had helped so many, earning the respect and admiration of the entire community. But what we didn't know, what no one knew, was that Ivan's past had been far darker than anyone could have imagined. My grandmother, who had known Ivan well for many years, once confided in me. "He's not just a saint," she said, her voice low. "There's a story he never tells. A story that weighs heavily on him." Curiosity piqued, I pressed her for more. That's when she told me what had truly shaped Ivan's life, long before he became the pillar of generosity that everyone admired. During World War II, Ivan had been forced to serve as an assassin for the Wildest, a Croatian fascist group with ties to the Nazis. As a young man, he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He had been trained to kill, to carry out orders without question. And one fateful day, Ivan and his best friend stumbled upon something that would change the course of their lives forever. A hoard of Nazi gold hidden deep in the mountains of Croatia. They took as much as they could carry, escaping with bags of gold coins, but the escape was anything but easy. As the war drew to a close, Ivan and his best friend were forced to kill their way out of Europe, evading both the Wildest and the Allies, who were determined to hunt down anyone involved in the theft. Their lives were at constant risk, and the violence they experienced during those days was unimaginable. Yet they managed to flee, eventually finding their way to Canada, where they believed they could start anew. The gold they had stolen was worth a fortune. It was a life-changing amount of money, enough to set them up comfortably for the rest of their lives. But it didn't erase the guilt. Ivan's best friend, who had shared in the spoils, soon passed away, and in his will, he left all of his newfound wealth to Ivan. But rather than taking the money and living a life of luxury, Ivan was overwhelmed by guilt for the lives he had taken and the wrongs he had committed. It was then that he began to change. No longer the ruthless man of war, Ivan became a man on a mission to make amends for his past. He used the wealth he had gained from the stolen gold to help others, particularly fellow immigrants who were trying to build new lives in Canada. He connected them with job opportunities, helped them settle in new neighborhoods, and most importantly, made them feel welcome in a foreign land. His life, however, was marked by a heavy burden of guilt, one that he carried with him until the day he died. Despite the kindness he showed to others, Ivan's dark past lingered in the shadows. He never returned to Croatia, and though he helped hundreds of people, he always remained a solitary figure, never marrying, never having children. When Ivan passed away, the community was devastated. The outpouring of grief from those whose lives he had touched was immense. His funeral was attended by dozens of families who came to pay their respects to a man who had truly changed their lives for the better. But as my grandmother told me, there were whispers of what Ivan had done during the war, of the secrets he had buried deep within himself. In the years since Ivan's passing, the story of his past has continued to haunt me. How could someone who had done such terrible things in his youth redeem himself so completely? The concept of redemption, of someone trying to atone for the darkness in their past, is a powerful one, and Ivan embodied it in ways that were difficult to comprehend. But even with all of his good deeds, I can't help but wonder if the weight of his past followed him to the grave. Was Ivan truly at peace with his actions? Or did the guilt continue to eat away at him despite all his good deeds? It's a question that still lingers in my mind even now, years after his death. I only hope that, in the end, the man who gave so much to others found some semblance of peace, no matter how much his past haunted him. Story 3. The couple who went through a nightmare. In a quiet rural town like ours, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Mary and John had always been seen as the perfect couple. They were the kind of people who made you believe that true love, the kind that endures through everything, really did exist. Their house, a small but charming cottage on the edge of town, was always well kept. Mary spent hours tending to her garden, making sure her roses bloomed in vibrant reds and soft pinks, while John often volunteered at the local food pantry, offering help without a second thought. They were loved by the community, and no one ever had a bad word to say about them. I remember being in awe of them. Mary was one of those people who always wore a smile, no matter the weather, and John's deep, gentle voice made him someone you'd turn to for advice without hesitation. The way they looked at each other, like the world could fall apart around them, but as long as they had each other, it was okay, made everyone around them think they had it all figured out. But despite their seemingly perfect life, there was always a strange feeling around them. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just an oddness that would occasionally drift by, like a breeze that made you pause for a second. Something about the way they spoke about their past was always vague. They rarely discussed family or friends from before they had settled in the town, and if they did, it was with an unsettling air of caution, as if the memories were too painful to revisit. Still, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. After all, they were kind, and people had a right to keep parts of their lives private. One summer afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the peaceful silence of the small town, when I noticed something unusual. The house across the street, the one that Mary and John lived in, was completely silent. Their truck was parked in the driveway, but neither of them was outside. No flowers in the garden were being watered, no laughter floated through the open windows. Days passed and the silence deepened. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe they were just on vacation or had gone to visit relatives. But then a week turned into 2 and still there was no sign of them. I can still remember the day when things took a darker turn. My mom came home from the grocery store, her face pale. She told me that she had spoken to the police, and there was something off about the situation. Mary and John hadn't been seen in weeks, and their absence was raising suspicion. The authorities had been contacted, but their investigation was slow. They said they had to wait a bit longer before they could do anything official. It didn't make sense. It was as though Mary and John had just disappeared into thin air. I can't explain why, but I felt a sense of unease settle in my stomach. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My mom tried to calm me down, reminding me that there was probably a simple explanation. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 weeks later, the police announced that they had found Mary and John. They had returned to town under strange circumstances. Mary in a dazed state and John, who was now in a wheelchair, barely able to speak. The entire community was relieved to see them again, but there was something deeply unsettling about their return. Mary's face was pale, her eyes distant, and she seemed to flinch at even the most mundane of questions. John too had changed. He was a shadow of the man he had been. His once powerful frame was now frail, his body stiff. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his once warm gaze had turned cold and distant. They insisted that they had been involved in a car accident and were recovering from injuries, but the story didn't quite add up. There was no sign of their vehicle being wrecked, no visible bruises on their bodies. It was as though the couple had gone through something much worse than a simple accident, something they were too terrified to discuss. For months, they kept to themselves, avoiding any questions from neighbors or friends. I remember seeing Mary one afternoon in the yard, pushing John in his wheelchair, her expression vacant. She never looked up when anyone greeted her. It was as though she was a different person, someone who had lost all the light that once filled her. John, too, never seemed to engage with anyone. His silence was deafening, and when he did speak, it was often with slurred words that didn't make much sense. It was only after John passed away nearly a year later that the truth finally came out. I'll never forget the day when their son came to town to handle the estate. He arrived with a heavy look in his eyes and immediately started going through their things. He had come to settle the matter quickly, but as the story unfolded, it became clear why Mary and John had been acting so strange for all those months. The truth was far more horrific than anyone had expected. John had a history of severe mental health problems that no one had known about. The couple had kept it a secret, choosing to handle things on their own, even as John's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He had been seeing a therapist for years, but things had only worsened after a particularly bad episode. One night, in a fit of rage, John had attacked Mary, stabbing her in a violent assault. He didn't stop until she had managed to crawl to the phone and call for help, barely able to hold on to life. She had been in a critical condition, but somehow she survived. What was even more disturbing was the fact that Mary had never told anyone what had happened. She kept the truth hidden for months, only allowing their son to know the full extent of the attack when he finally arrived to help. She didn't want anyone to know the truth. She didn't want the small town to think of John as a monster. But the most chilling part was this: Mary never once blamed John. Despite what he had done, despite the terror and pain he had caused, she chose to protect him. She believed that he was still the man she had loved, the one who had once helped the community, the one who had once been her whole world. She never spoke ill of him, never asked for pity, and never sought revenge. Instead, she continued to care for him even after everything that had happened. When their son revealed the truth, people were in shock. Mary's strength in the face of such horror was both heartbreaking and inspiring. But it also left a haunting question in the air: How much darkness can one person endure before they break? And how much of it can one person forgive? I still remember the way people looked at Mary after John's death. She seemed like a woman who had lived through a nightmare but could never wake up. There was no justice, no closure. There was only the quiet resignation of a life that had been torn apart by something that could never be fixed. Her house eventually sold, and she disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only memories of a couple who had seemed perfect, but whose true story had been hidden in the shadows for so long. Some people said she moved to another town, while others believed she simply couldn't bear to live with the past any longer. For me, though, the memory of Mary and John has never really left. Their story serves as a reminder of how things are never as perfect as they seem on the surface. Everyone carries a secret, a pain, or a burden they don't want others to see. And sometimes, no matter how much we want to help, we can't always fix what's broken. Some things are simply too dark to heal. Story 4, The Forgotten Village. Deep in the heart of the mountains, hidden by dense forests and winding rivers, there was a village that had long since vanished from the maps. The locals, those who lived in nearby towns, spoke of it only in hushed tones, as if speaking its name aloud would bring bad luck. No one really knew why the village had been abandoned or even when it had happened. It was as though the entire village had disappeared overnight, swallowed up by the forest or lost to time itself. As a young man, I had always been intrigued by old legends, stories of places and people long forgotten. I had heard about this village from my grandfather, who had spoken of it with a mixture of fear and respect. He claimed to have visited it when he was young, along with a group of his friends. He told me that the village was full of strange things, that the people who had lived there had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some believed they had been cursed, others said they had simply fled in fear of something they couldn't explain. The stories haunted me, and as I grew older, the curiosity gnawed at me. I had to see it for myself, to discover whether the stories were true or if they were just the ramblings of an old man. Armed with nothing more than a map I had drawn from the scraps of information my grandfather had given me, I set off one morning, determined to find the village. It took days to reach the outskirts of the forest that was said to surround the village. The path was overgrown with thick vines, and the air felt heavy as if the forest itself was watching me. But I pressed on, my excitement outweighing my growing unease. The deeper I went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of trees or the rustle of leaves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, I stumbled upon the first sign of human habitation, a crumbling stone wall half hidden by moss and ivy. My heart raced. This was it, the forgotten village. I pushed aside the vines and stepped through the opening in the wall. What I found was both breathtaking and terrifying. The village was eerily still, as if it had been frozen in time. The houses, though weathered and decayed, still stood upright, their wooden beams blackened with age. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the branches above. But what struck me most was the overwhelming sense of desolation. It was as though the village had been abandoned in a hurry, as if the people had fled without looking back, leaving everything behind. I wandered through the village, feeling an odd sense of unease creeping over me. There were no signs of life, no animals, no birds, nothing. It was as if the place itself was dead. But the strangest thing was the way everything was arranged. The houses were left in perfect order, as though the inhabitants had been in the middle of their daily routines when they vanished. One house had a table set for dinner, with plates still on it, though they were long since cracked and covered in dust. Another had a bed with a blanket pulled back, as if someone had gotten up and left in the night. I made my way to the center of the village, where a small stone well stood, its surface darkened with age. Something about the well seemed to draw me in, though I couldn't say why. I knelt down to peer into it, but before I could see anything, a sudden chill swept through the air, and I heard a noise, faint like a whispering voice carried on the wind. I froze, listening, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood up, shaken. Was it the wind? Was it just my imagination? Or was there something more? As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange in the corner of my eye, a movement just beyond the village square. I looked closely, but there was nothing there, only trees and shadows. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt as though I was being watched. I decided to leave the village. It was getting late and I hadn't planned on staying overnight. But as I turned to retrace my steps, I realized that I couldn't find the path I had taken to enter. The trees and undergrowth seemed to have closed in behind me, blocking any trace of the trail. Panic began to set in. I wasn't sure which way to go, and the silence of the village was deafening. It was as though the whole forest had closed in around me, trapping me within its borders. I tried to calm myself and decided to head toward the edge of the village, hoping to find some sign of the way out. As I walked, I came across a small building near the village's edge, its door slightly ajar. Drawn by curiosity, I entered. The inside was dark, with only a sliver of light coming from a crack in the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in old wooden crates and boxes. But in the corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A collection of old photographs pinned to the wall. The photographs were black and white, showing people I didn't recognize. But what was strange was the way they were arranged. Each photo had been marked with a date and a name. And as I looked closer, I realized that many of the names were the same as the streets in the village. But it wasn't the names that made my stomach churn, it was the dates. Most of the photos were dated more than 50 years ago, but some were marked with dates that were far more recent. One photograph caught my eye. It was of a woman standing on the porch of one of the houses in the village. Her eyes were wide and hollow, and her expression was one of sheer terror. The date on the photograph read, July 13, 1997. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had read somewhere that the village had been abandoned many decades ago. But this photo was proof that someone had been there, someone had lived here long after the supposed abandonment. My mind raced with questions, but before I could process them, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was now pitch black, and I could hear something moving in the darkness, something breathing. The whispering voices from before grew louder, filling my ears with a constant hum, like a chorus of people speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Fear gripped me, and I felt as though I was suffocating. In a blind panic, I ran toward the door, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't open. The voices were growing louder, more urgent, as if they were all around me. I felt something cold brush against my skin, and I turned just in time to see a figure standing in the corner of the room. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could make out a faint glow around it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. I managed to break free from the room and ran through the village, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest. The village, the people, the whispers, they all seemed to fade behind me as I ran, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, something that had been hidden for a reason. I never returned to that village, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But I'll never forget the photographs, the whispers, or the shadow in the corner of that dark room. There are some things in this world that should remain forgotten, and some places that are better left untouched. Some mysteries, no matter how much we crave answers, are best left unsolved. Story 5, The Last Letter. It was a cold winter evening when I found the letter. The fire crackled quietly in the hearth, its warmth struggling against the biting chill that had seeped into the house. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if urging me to leave the comfort of my home. But I was too exhausted to go anywhere. It had been a long day of work, and I was ready to curl up with a good book and a cup of tea. As I settled into my favorite armchair, I noticed an old box tucked away in the corner of the room. I had forgotten about it. It was something I had inherited from my late grandmother, an assortment of old family keepsakes, faded photographs, and letters that had never been opened. For years I had meant to go through it to learn more about my ancestors, but somehow I had always put it off. Tonight, though, something felt different. I reached for the box, curiosity gnawing at me. The moment I opened it, a cloud of dust rose into the air, making me cough. Inside were all sorts of trinkets, some familiar, some foreign. I sorted through the box, touching each item carefully, wondering about its significance. Most of it was ordinary: a locket, a couple of old coins, a tarnished pocket watch. But one item caught my eye, an envelope yellowed with age, sealed with dark red wax. It was addressed to no one in particular, simply marked, "To my beloved." My heart skipped a beat. There was something about this letter that felt important, as though it held a secret that had been waiting to be uncovered for years. I carefully peeled back the wax seal, the brittle paper crinkling under my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in delicate script. The handwriting was elegant, yet the words on the page seemed to tremble, as if they had been written in haste. The letter read, "My dearest love, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you or if you will ever understand why I did what I did. But I must write it anyway because there is something that has been weighing on my heart for so long, and I cannot carry it any longer. When we met, I was not the person I appeared to be. I had already made decisions that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The lies I told you, the choices I made were not to hurt you but to protect you. You must believe me, I never wanted to hurt you. But now everything has changed. I have seen things that I cannot explain. They are watching us and they are not human. They are not from this world and I fear that they will come for us both. They will stop at nothing to have what they want, and I am afraid that I cannot protect you any longer. You must leave and never look back. I wish I could be there with you to hold you and keep you safe, but I know that it is too late for that now. The moment you read this letter, you must flee. You cannot stay here. If you do, they will find you and there will be no escape. Please forgive me for all I have done. I love you more than you will ever know, and I hope that one day you will understand why I had to leave. Goodbye, my love. Stay safe. The letter was signed only with a name, Evelyn. I sat there, staring at the paper in my hands, trying to make sense of what I had just read. The words were haunting, filled with a sense of urgency and terror that seemed to bleed through the ink. Who was Evelyn? And who had she written this letter to? More importantly, what had she meant by "they are not human"? What had she seen? The room around me seemed to grow colder as I turned the letter over, hoping to find more clues, but there was nothing. The back was blank. I sank back into the chair, my mind racing. It felt as though the letter had been written for me, as if the universe had conspired to make sure I found it tonight. As I sat there in the silence, I began to feel a strange unease settle over me. The wind outside howled louder, the trees creaking against the force of the storm. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. I felt watched. My skin prickled and I glanced nervously around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more oppressive. The fire flickered, casting strange, shifting shapes on the walls. A sudden knock at the door broke the silence. I jumped, my heart racing. It was so late, who could it be? I stood up, hesitating for a moment. The knock came again, more insistent this time. With a deep breath, I crossed the room and opened the door. Standing on the doorstep was a man, drenched from the rain, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked as though he had been running for miles. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his hands trembled as he reached for something inside his coat. Are you Evelyn?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Please, you have to help me. They're here. They found me." I froze, my mind racing. Evelyn? The name from the letter? What was happening? Who was this man and why was he looking for her? "I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken," I said, trying to make sense of the situation. "There's no one named Evelyn here." The man's eyes widened in fear. He glanced over his shoulder as though expecting someone, or something, to be right behind him. No, you don't understand," he stammered. "Evelyn wrote me a letter. She said you would help me. She said you would know what to do. Please, they're coming." Before he could finish his sentence, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness beyond the door. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to see what it was. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps, trying to make sense of what was happening. The letter, the man, the terrifying growl, it was all too much. I turned, looking around the room for something, anything that could explain what was going on. And then my eyes landed on the letter again. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I read it once more, hoping for some new clue, some hint of what I needed to do. But the words hadn't changed. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I knew then, with a cold certainty, that the danger was no longer outside. It had followed me in.